Hello, everyone. My name is Bonnie Sun. I'm the Senior Marketing and Communications Manager at the Museum of Anthropology. I'd like to acknowledge that I am living and working on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh people. In my family lineage, I am the first generation Chinese born in Canada. My father is from Guangdong, China, and my mother was born in Hong Kong. I just wanted to share a little bit of that context. And today I have the great privilege of speaking with Dr. Tzu-I Chung, who is the curator of history at the Royal British Museum in Victoria. The context of the conversation we're having today takes place in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is 1 year on now, and also in the context of recent resurgences of across North America of anti-Asian and particularly anti-Chinese racism and hate crimes. So I'd like to ask Dr. Chung today about how our work in museums influence and are influenced by these disturbing social phenomena. So thank you, Dr. Chung, for speaking with me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Bonnie. It's really appreciated that we actually have a chance to talk. I'm speaking from the Algonquin speaking people of the Sanghees and Esquimalt nations, and I respectfully acknowledge that it's their traditional territories.
Thank you. So tell me more about this exhibition last year that you unveiled in 2020. It's a pop-up exhibition that's still up in Fantan Alley in Victoria's Chinatown called Peering into the Past, Celebrating Canada's Oldest Chinatown. And if I'm not mistaken, it's a joint project with the Chinese Canadian Museum. Can you tell us a bit more about this exhibition and why a project like this is significant and the impact that you'd hope to make in designing it?
So the Victoria Chinatown Museum Society has been looking for a site in Victoria's Chinatown, which is Canada's oldest Chinatown, to actually have a presence about community self-expressions of their sense of communities and place and culture in the middle of Chinatown. And I think this pop-up exhibit is the first step towards that. It's a teaser on a very small scope that we put together. And it is really about the community connections and the community's expressions through arts and culture. And I think it is a very meaningful project because the communities initiated themselves, and also it is in that place where they feel they belong. And it is about really sharing their material culture and sharing the spirit behind that material culture, that sense of communities. And I think that's where it is really nice to help with this type of project where we work with the communities where they are united against stereotyping and scapegoating and any type of kind of mythologies about the communities, and then just really have the communities speak for themselves.
Thank you. And as a historian, you might be quite familiar then, of course, that looking back in history at these communities, that racism and discrimination have been experienced by these first generations of Chinese immigrants since they first arrived. And there's also now this recent surge of hate crimes against Asians during the pandemic. And do you see a link? Is it useful to talk about the link between between these trends or phenomena? Does the link even exist, and why is it worth investigating?
Thanks for asking that. It has been really weighing very heavily on my mind. Last year, in addition to Peering to the Past exhibit, I also had another exhibit in our pocket gallery at the Royal BC Museum. It's called A Tale of Two Families. It features a French Canadian and a Chinese Canadian family who were both marginalized. And as such, it was very difficult to find any family that have written records and the evidence that can trace their family lineage all the way back to the the gold rush time of 1858 for a lot of the marginalized communities. So these two communities and families, they were amazing in that sense that they went through much harsher times of economic depressions and discriminations, and they survived and continue to this day prospering as a family, each of them. So I think from that story, it was also very important to see how the kind of anti-Asian racism and hate crimes have never been wanting. They have always been there the moment these different people arrived in this land for the gold rush in 1858. And what really, like, if you look at all these different stories and just the historical trajectories, you will see that whenever there were economic challenges and political struggles or cultural divisions, as soon as there is any type of resource competition and any type of challenges like that, there are going to be this type of scapegoating, targeting certain ethnic groups to be the scapegoat. And that's why representation is a real big issue that people should look into. Like, they shouldn't just look at some type of representation such as China virus and then just internalize it. What people really need is to think about these terms and why they show up. So what happened was last year, I also did some work in terms of juxtaposing the four generations of these two different families and try to show how they survived all these hardship and all these racism and all the discriminations in terms of being marginalized and a minority. And it just shows that there have been all these different links between the past and the current hate crimes or discrimination. And at the same time, it is also really important for us to think about how to move forward with that type of historical understanding, with that type of cultural understanding to make the right choices.
Mm-hmm. The four generations really demonstrates the idea of living history and also the resilience between generations, that these families continue to persevere and be leaders in the community too.
Yes,
in that exhibition.
very important.
Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned these two mini exhibitions that you've put on in the past year. Would you say that the current anti-racism, or pardon me, the current anti-racism work and also the anti-Asian racism sentiment that's out there, does that affect your professional life as far as a curator and a historian, and how you approach your work?
So what has happened since last March in terms of the mounting anti-Asian racism has really pressured me to further reflect on what I can do in my own capacity to address these issues, because from my self-understanding, my overarching work is about creating space and creating opportunities for community self-expressions in order for people to really develop that kind of intercultural understanding of different people's experiences. And based on that type of intercultural understanding, we develop empathy and we develop collective work towards the elimination of any discrimination. So for me, it's really about the work towards social justice, that we actually do this type of sharing experiences work and looking into history and culture for answers. And so what has been really difficult is that I felt like you also work at the museum, so you understand how our museum target audience is really about age 5 to 95,
Mm.
regardless of their backgrounds. And I think that's where these type of work really needs to speak to people of all different backgrounds, because um, anti-Asian racism is a social issue, and the issue can only be addressed if there are cross-cultural, cross-ethnic, and just like really mainstream efforts to actually work against it. And that takes a lot of understanding. A lot of Asian Canadians and Asian Americans have done a lot of work, to raise awareness, but also in the same time they have to spend extra time to fend for themselves, like attending self-defense workshops, how to deal with racial slurs, racial attacks, and all these other things. And I think it's really up to every single member of this society to actually act on the fact that it is not okay, it should not be tolerated, but why is it still happening? Can everybody please do something together, instead of putting the pressure on the Asian Canadians to prove that they are worthy members of the society. I felt like it is really important to educate the mainstream audience about it, and I think that's where we see our museum work needs to do, and that's where we are really challenged to figure out how to do it.
That's it. And you mentioned the empathy building, and that's exactly where the work lies, in kind of taking down racism. It's in the interpersonal relationships and understandings. And you mentioned some of the practical steps that museums can take, and that as individuals we can take. Do you have any other ideas or practical solutions or steps that we can take as museum workers to advance that work?
I think for us, of course, every single one of us needs to feel committed to understanding these kind of issues, and really to collectively work together on trying to figure out ways to envision and create a society of real justice where we can claim that there is no discrimination. So first of all, we need to build that on the foundation of understanding our own privileges, and then also understand the importance of cross-cultural alliances. Like, we all need to take steps to understand each other's experiences, and then say that we, with the same type of understanding and with the goal of creating a better society together, that we actually put our heads together and figure out how to do this. And I think that's where the real commitment can happen, is when cross-cultural, cross-ethnic lines of different people with different needs can actually make the type of choices to say, I want to educate myself, and I also want to commit myself to this type of work. And then we create allyship in the kind of advancing of this type of work. So I think all the different museum work, as we all know very well, is very, very collaborative.
Mhm.
And we all require cross-departmental forces to actually get anything done. And I think this is the same. Like, we need a lot of different members of the society to do this work. And we are in the process of kind of capacity building, alliance building, to actually get to where we want. And finally, I just really want to say, I really believe that art heals, culture transforms, and history really holds up a mirror to our time. And when we look at history and then we look at our time, we need to think about how we can make the right choices in challenging times, so that we go down in history with much prouder moments than our predecessors. But also, we really want to think about how do we want to collectively transform our cultures and look into art for creative solutions as well.
That's a really powerful and empowering note to end on. It's a great way to cap off our conversation, which is brief, but the work is deep. And so I thank you for that note that we ended on. Thank you for your time today, Dr. Chung.
Thank you so much, Bunny. I really appreciate your being there.
Thank you.